Welcome to Podcast Hubungan International. This podcast is brought to you by the Department of International Relations, Universitas Gadjah Mada in collaboration with Podcast Damai Pangkal Damai. I'm your host, Diah Kusumaningrum. October 2nd, which is Mahatma Gandhi's birthday, has been widely celebrated as the International Day of Nonviolence. In this double episode, we'll be talking about nonviolent resistance amidst digital repression. We are joined by Janjira Sombatpoonsiri and Alfredo Putrawodjoyo. In the first part of this episode, we have discussed a report that Janjira co-written with Dean on digital repression in Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, and Vietnam, and juxtaposed it with Alfredo's observation on digital repression in Indonesia. In this second part of the episode, we'll be looking at how various parts of the society push back against digital repression using methods of nonviolent resistance. So, we've talked about digital repression. We see here and there that such repression is met by resistance, where actors try to push back against digital repression. Here in Indonesia, one of the latest pushback would be the hashtag Blokir Kominfo, or block the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology. Alfredo, do you want to say something on this? Why, how effective?
These Blokir Kominfo, or block the Minister of Communication, it's a play on the latest ministry regulation. I guess not the latest, but it's the most salient currently. The Ministerial Regulation number 5 of 2020. Basically, it's a copy of several internet regulations that is, I think, popular also in Europe. I think it's a copy of the NetzDG regulation in Germany, if I'm not mistaken, that before social media companies are free from liability if there's user-generated content that can be deemed dissenting or negative content. So Indonesia tries to copy that makes social media companies liable, and they force these social media companies or internet companies like electronic service operators providers to monitor them more thoroughly. And Indonesia is implementing this and also implementing a regulation where these ESOs or electronic service operators must register with the Indonesian government, and if they don't register, they're going to be blocked. And this happened. Several big, very important players have been blocked. PayPal, Steam, the gaming marketplace, and Yahoo. And there was also threats, for WhatsApp and all these companies from the Meta company was going to be blocked. Some of them registered in time, but some of them didn't. And the ones that was blocked for at least a couple of days, and the impact was quite immense. Seeing light of this, several civil society organizations, organized, and seeing the opportunity to also organize with consumers that are usually maybe not so involved in civil disobedience, but because it involved their daily lives. Freelancers from PayPal, etc., and gamers, they have a huge number following, and they're quite, fanatic about it. They have quite a large following to take part in this activism, either online or offline. Going to the office of the Ministry of Communication and Information, using rude gestures and so on and so forth. And the numerous response by the ministry that are not sympathetic, or at least cannot be read as a well thought of public communication, and it's not a well designed or well implemented public policy. It's quite concerning for the future, and I think it's still going on until now. The demands are for these regulations to be either revised or revoked entirely, and it's still it's still active up until now.
Okay. Back to Janjira. do you see any pushback, against this digital repression? And by this, I mean at least two things. Can you comment on the various nonviolent resistance against those repression, and also the various resistance against other forms of violence that are happening in the Southeast Asia that are done in the digital space?
I mean, this is important, but this very difficult question for me to answer. I mean, I've been thinking about it. I haven't come up with anything systematic, and I think I mean, before exploring resistance, right? I think we have to kind of understand what repression entails, right? And what digital repression actually means when it comes to resisting it. Yeah. And so as I said before, repression is basically about raising the cost of political participation. Yeah. And in so doing, those who unleash the repression have to be able to make sure that they can demobilize, right? The end goal is to demobilize activism. And I mean, in the current insights, in the current studies, you have two effects of repression. One is definitely demobilization, when you have all sorts of repressive practices that result in basically deterring or making resistance ineffective. But at the other end of the spectrum, it can escalate the conflicts and actually escalate the resistance as well, because and this is Diah, you are familiar with this assumption, because this is what nonviolent resistance literature and research want to highlight and want to push activists to do, right? That you have to be able to reverse the negative consequences of repression, right? Yeah. And so a couple of insights, right? A couple of insights is that if you, there's a belief that if nonviolent movements maintain what they're doing, maintain so-called nonviolent discipline by confronting the security forces without resorting to retaliation, so on and so forth, then you would be able to basically mobilize public support around this repression, and therefore it would expand movement, even cause defection among security forces, so on and so forth. What I want to bring to light is actually the underpinning assumption of what we researchers in nonviolent resistance means by repression. So we tend to see repression in terms of the use of arms, the use of violence, and I mean, strictly speaking, physical violence against non-violent resistors, right? And therefore you have this dichotomy between violent oppressors using forces, violent governments, violent corporates using forces against non-violent unarmed people. And this, what we haven't actually discussed is that we take this mechanism as if it's automatic. But in fact, there's a lot of work going into making this contrasting image visible in public, right? So you need to frame the incident as an act of injustice. You actually need to make it visible, and therefore the role of social media in circulating, in spreading the words about how violent, how brutal the regimes are, right? And so this seems to be underlying. assumption when we conceptualize, or we teach, or we tell our students how nonviolent resistance work. Now, digital repression is a different form of control. It's not the control through the use of physical violence. It's the social control, it's cultural control, and eventually it can achieve basically self-control, right? And that's why Alfredo said this very on-point word, this shielding effect of using digital repression. And so in so doing, when you think about, for example, my ongoing research regards the state use of spyware to snoop activists, right? I mean, apparently this doesn't entail the use of force in the traditional sense, but it creates such creepy feelings. I mean, even for me as a researcher, I mean, these days I use my phone, and I always have what the activists told me in the back of my head all the time. And I'm even more careful than before. I don't say things that I'm not supposed to say, and that would land me in jail, right? So this is just an example that repression has become less visible, right? So remember, this visibility of repression makes the reversal of its detrimental effects become more productive for nonviolent resistors. But when repression is not visible, it's actually creeping in your everyday life, and therefore there's no image of bloodshed on the street. There is no image of this dichotomy between violent and non-violent parties to the conflict, right? So this kind of clear-cut imaginary is gone. So now the brutal conclusion I arrive is that, so what's the point of maintaining non-violent discipline then? Right? When the other side, at least the violence of the other side is no longer visible. So what's the effect? Is there any point of maintaining non-violent discipline? And so, I mean, I think, we have to brainstorm this. I haven't come up with any positive strategy or solution. But I think what we have to do, at least as researchers, is understanding it and basically rethink our assumptions regarding dealing with repression. And the pushbacks have to be based on this new or revised insight.
Okay, so you were highlighting how political jiu-jitsu, moral jiu-jitsu in non-violent resistance can take place when the difference between the actors are so stark. You have the violent oppressor on the one hand, and you have the non-violent unarmed resistors on the other hand. And we as researchers, need to discuss what to do when this polarization is not that clear. Well, I'm also just thinking out loud here. I'd like to go back to the mechanisms that you brought in earlier today, politicization and the weaponization. So I think from the perpetrator's side, whether or not an information is factual is no longer that important. What's important for them is that such information brings dire consequences. So maybe from our side too, it's more important to devote our energy not into fact-checking per se, but in debunking the claim that certain information has dire consequences. So when we manage to establish that the claim of these dire consequences is false, then we can also debunk that the repression was justified, meaning that we establish that the repression is unjustified. Also, back to your point that the forms and intensity of digital repression has to do with the state's capacity and with how important the state sees digital economy, perhaps we can think of methods that erodes the state capacity. I mean, methods of nonviolent actions, of nonviolent resistance that erodes the state's capacity in performing digital repression. For example, making the states unable to get as many digital troops as they prefer, or, blocking them from acquiring certain spyware and such, or to get key actors in the digital economy to make it costly for governments to perform digital repression. So, like the idea that these key actors may boycott or may move to a different country with better regulation and such, perhaps by implanting those assumptions, then the government will think twice before performing digital repression. Well, I don't know. This is just, me brainstorming. What do you think, Janjira?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that is very important to think about the mechanisms of repression and then sort of work to disentangle that, right? Based on, I mean, these days I interview activists, talk to people just to get an idea of how things are done when it comes to, countering digital repression. And there are a couple of things that I think are quite insightful. Number one is that what the best, in my opinion, the best practice is prevention, right? So you have to start mobilizing to actually counter any passage of cyber laws that could be abused. You have to mobilize to deter any measures of internet controls if these are not backed by the rule of law, right? And so I think when the prevention measure is successful, then it set an institutional precedent for the subsequent deterrence. What I mean is this: concretely, in the case of Thailand, for example, 2015, there was a proposal by the government, the junta back then, to initiate same like China's firewall and Cambodia's national internet gateway. We call that single gateway, right? So the entire society, and this is your point, Diah, digital economy, not only civil society, but also the business sector were really upset about this, because that means that, their access to the internet would be compromised, right? This would basically be bad for them, for business sector and for gamers. So you have this weird, unholy coalition between, telecommunications companies and business sectors, the online shopping outlets and gamers. So basically came together and actually pushed back against the proposal. So the proposal became basically it was dropped, right? And after that, and this is what I mean, an institutional precedent. After that, even though the proposal researched every here and then because of the repression that's going on, it's never been materialized. It's always, people always like, yeah, come again. We don't want that. We know what it is. So I think prevention for me is a best practice.
Yeah.
And the second thing is actually two parts that I've been thinking about is protection and pushbacks. Protection is also crucial, because when you talk to activists who basically have limited technology, and I'm one of them, right? Until today, I don't know anything about technology and actually how you can be harmed in digital space. But we have to educate each other more how to protect yourselves using social media for mobilization. Do you use VPN? Do you use anything that would protect you from being detected, right? And actually being charged from your online activity. So, I find that activists are not so or haven't caught up with this knowledge. And I think we have to discuss this more. This is a part of capacity building for nonviolent resistance, right?
Yes.
And lastly, I think pushbacks. I mean, this is for me when things are bad already, and then you start to do stuff to basically prevent it from going from bad to worse. And so pushbacks are what Alfredo just said, and the action that Diah you just said happening in Indonesia. That means the law has been passed, has been enforced. Certain regulation is abused for further control already, and then you do something about it, campaigns, lobbying, things like that. I think this can work in terms of serving as a check and balance mechanism, just to make sure that the authorities actually implement these regulatory measures according to the rule of law, right? But again, we know in our countries this thing is hard to come by, rule of law. So this is the part that I'm still struggling with. How can we come up with a better, more strategically valuable pushback strategies, right? And I think I rest my hope on people like Alfredo, because you are activists on the ground and you're doing really important, meaningful stuff on the ground.
Yes, thank you very much, Janjira. Just again, another hunch. A lot of activism that used to take place in just in the everyday now has been moved to the digital space. One of the arguments that we have in our research project Damai Pangkal Damai is that a lot of the movements have not really been effective because they rely mostly on protest and persuasion, not very much relying on methods of non-cooperation, let alone methods of non-violent intervention. And when we see activism in the digital space, be it against digital repression or other issues, it seems like, most of the tactics, most of the methods fall under protest and persuasion category. So I guess this is also like a big puzzle to us, how to bring in non-cooperation and non-violent intervention in the digital space. We're already at the end of our podcast now. Janjira, thank you very much. Do you still have like any last thing you want to share with our audience out there?
No, I actually think the common comment that I often receive with my talk on digital repression is it's so depressing, it's so pessimistic. What can we do about this, right? But I think the fact that we are now discussing it, we are bringing or shedding light on this subject. This is the beginning of something useful in the future, right? Something more forward-looking in the future. And also, I think that the beginning of this conversation should be along the line of basically gathering experience, coming up with, if there are authoritarian innovations, then you have to come up with democratic innovations. You have to come up with human rights-based innovations. So how can we do that? I think this is a question moving forward.
No time for complacency, right?
Correct.
this is the end of our podcast. Thank you very much, Janjira and Alfredo. Do you have anything you want to say to our audience?
Just don't forget to subscribe to the Hayu Game YouTube channel. Of course, turn on the notification bell and follow Hayu Games podcast on Spotify, Anchor, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and wherever you can find podcasts from.
And follow Damai Pangkal Damai's podcast on Spotify. So thank you very much. Stay tuned and happy International Day of Nonviolence. Peace out.